and welcome to our Acts study. As we are coming to almost the end of our Acts study, we're in Acts chapter 27 tonight. Acts chapter 27. Now, I think last week we said our word was intentionality, and everything was intentional by even the way that Paul spoke, the way that he reached forth in his chains. This week, it's a real simple word, probably a word you learned in the second grade, storms. We're gonna pay very close attention to this storm. There's like this terrible storm taking place. And I think that if we're careful tonight, that we can pull a lot of great insight about how God deals with us during storms. So tonight we're talking about storms in Acts 27. I'm reading out of the NIV version. It reads this way. It says, when it was decided that they would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about a sailed for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus and Macedonia from Thessalonica was with us. Now watch this. So Paul, of course, he went before King Agrippa last week. That'll be the last time we hear from King Agrippa. This week he's getting on a boat headed for Rome. Now, remember, he's a prisoner, he's in chains, but they let him bring some friends. And I just want to ask you, I want you to really think about it. Who do you know that goes to prison, goes to jail, and they can say, hey, they're with me. They can come on and ride. Get on the bus with me. We're going to Tuscaloosa or wherever else. But clearly, two things either happened. One thing that could have happened is Luke and Aristarchus could have said, we're slaves of Paul. But we know that's a lie, and that's not true. And the other thing is that we will see throughout the entire chapter is that they don't think that Paul is guilty of anything. And so it's highly likely that he said, y'all can come because there's really no merit to this case. And we're going to see on several occasions this chapter that Paul is just going to be shown favor outright. And I just want to point this out to you that there will be seasons in your life where you will be going through storms and you will be in bad situations, but God will show you unmerited favor that doesn't make sense. And it is one of the purest perks of walking with Christ. A lot of times in church, we glorify, favor ain't fair. And we always talk about favor as if it only comes when things are good. But a lot of times, God's greatest favor shows up in seasons where you don't think God is even present. And so this is just a small example. I want you to notice that he was put into the care of a centurion who just means they're responsible for 100 troops. And a lot of times they would put a centurion on a boat with prisoners to make sure that the prisoners didn't get out of hand. Ironically, they're on a boat that is for grain. It's full of grain. It's just headed to Rome, and the Roman government paid a little extra money to put the prisoners on the boat because it was going that direction. Let's keep going. The next day we landed in Sidon, and Julius, in his kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. Again, what prisoner do you know that when we docked to get gas, and they didn't have gas back then, we make a stop, that they let them get off, go hang out with their friends, and a lot of my research shows that they hung out for 7 days. He went and stayed at their house, basically got him a hotel room and hung out there like nothing had happened. And so he goes and he's got this freedom that is not typical of someone who is in chains. Let's keep going. Keep that in mind. That's going to be important. From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the Sea of Cyprus because of the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed in Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. So they swapped ships. Let's keep going. We made a slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off of Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to Lee of Crete, opposite of Salmone. Anybody ever been on a sailboat? No? Well, I went on a sailing trip back in August, and it was the first time I ever sailed a boat by myself. And the first thing that they taught us, when they pulled out the book, had us in the room with all our little rope, they said, you can go this way into the wind, you can go this way into the wind, You can go this way into the wind. We can even teach you how to go backwards into the wind, but what you can't do is go directly into the wind. It won't work no matter how fancy the boat is, no matter how great it is, because of the way that sails are set up. You can't go that way. So basically what it told us in verse 6 is that the wind was fighting them and that there was no way for them to get to Rome. I want you to consider this. It is easy on the first read to think, okay, well, maybe God is trying to keep them from getting to Rome because he has so much he could be doing, so much he could be accomplishing. But I want us tonight to get in our minds that we're going to begin to embrace obstacles. Because a lot of times in obstacles, God has the opportunity to show exactly who he is and what he can do. But I think, and I don't know if it's an American thing, I don't know if it's a 2025 thing, obstacles show up and a lot of us get to the place where we're like, okay, well, I got to go the opposite way. I got to go we get like water, go in the path of least resistance. When a lot of times it is the path of resistance that we get stronger. I've learned I tried to lift weights for years, but I didn't get results until I started lifting heavy. And like heavy to the point where it hurts. But when I started lifting heavy to the point that it hurts, all of a sudden I started gaining muscle mass because the resistance against my muscle caused my muscle to go into a different place than it would have any other time. Here, let me help you. Sometimes in life, God sends storms or he sends hard things. He sends things that stretch us. He sends, for parents, he sends a child that challenges you. For some of us, he sends a boss that we don't really care for. He puts us in positions that stretch us. And our instant inclination is often, I'm going to quit, or I'm going to walk away, or I'm not going to deal with this. But God often puts us in a pathway where we have to fight the storm so that we can see what we're made of. Does that make sense? Is that clear? So they made slow headway, and that didn't mean that they turned around and went back. That meant that they got on a new boat, and they continued their course. Verse 8. It says, we moved along the course with difficulty, and they came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous by now, and it was after the Day of Atonement, so Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. So watch this. They get to a place called Fair Havens, and Fair Havens was a blank canvas. It was like, it wasn't a deserted island, but it was like if you told me, hey, Cole, I want you to go hang out in Aniana for the next 3 months, and I just want you to be there. And you can't leave because your car is not going to be able to go, but I just want you to hang out in Aniana. Like Aniana has a McDonald's and maybe a Walmart. But if I had to choose a place between Aniana and Birmingham, I'm going to choose Birmingham because Birmingham has more options. I can go out to eat. I got grocery store options. I can do more things, and that gives me more options. So what we're going to see in the next verse is they're going to say, well, let's go 40 more miles so that we can rest somewhere and spend the winter somewhere that's fun. He points out that it's after the Day of Atonement because the Day of Atonement is right at the beginning of winter. And so he puts that in the text so that people will be able to understand it's cold outside and the waters get really choppy when it's cold outside. Has anybody ever heard of the Drake Passage? All right, so on the bottom of our dear globe, in between South America, Chile in South America, and Antarctica, there's this passage called the Drake Passage. The Drake Passage is considered one of the most deadliest bodies of water on earth. But people, thousands of people, cross it every year because they want to see Antarctica. They want to see what it's like on the least inhabited continent on earth. And so people risk their lives to cross this piece of land. I've seen TikToks where the ship is doing like this and the waves are up on top and the ships are literally fighting for their lives just to get across. And that's an exaggeration, but what happens when the cold, wet weather comes in to the ocean is it causes choppy passage. Now, I want you to think about this. In wintertime, in the barren season, in a season that's already rough to survive, the water, we're going to try to cross the water in a season where we're already struggling. A season where people usually take the winter off, especially in this time in the biblical age, because they were an agrarian society. People weren't working this time of the year. People weren't crossing oceans this time of the year. Everybody was going home and going to sleep. They were a lot like I was last week when it snowed. I didn't come out the house for 48 hours. My truck didn't move, you know. And so, but in that time of the year, all over the globe, that was normal. But the people, they decided that getting Paul and this grain was so important that they were going to risk life and limb to get across the water. And so Paul, who is a prisoner, says, I don't think it's a good idea. Y'all don't see those waves? I see those waves. And we're right here docked at Fairhaven. I know that y'all can't go get drunk and do the things you want to do, but, I know that that's what sailors like to do. I think we need to stay right here because then we might survive. But then they said, but we don't want to do that. And I just want you to consider, how many times have you been in the back seat? And I don't really like backseat drivers, but been in the back seat, and you knew a faster way to get there. And you told the driver, hey, if you turn right here, we could save 5 minutes. And the driver said, I'm the one driving. They said, hey, you stay in the back seat, you backseat driver. And so in a lot of ways, although Paul had the wisdom, he didn't have the position or the stature to give the advice, and so no one listened. And I don't know about you, but sometimes it's frustrating when you could do a better job than the person driving, but you don't have the steering wheel in your hand. And so with the calmest voice and the nicest tone, you're trying to give advice, but nobody's listening. That's where Paul is right here. Let's keep going, verse 12. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hopping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both the southwest and the northwest. Now, y'all know Crete is like where Santorini is. Have you ever seen the pictures of the pretty mountainside? If you've not seen it, I promise if you type in Crete or Santorini on TikTok, it's going to come up and you're going to be like, man, I want to go on vacation there. It was pretty then, it's pretty now. And so they were set on making it there instead of being at Fair Harbor. Let's keep going. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. And so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. They said, oh, it's just a gentle wind. We can make it. We can make it. It's not that bad right now. And it reminds me of like if you've ever driven through like the Tallapoosa Street exit and you said, oh, it's just a little rain. It's not that bad. And then you keep driving, next thing you know, your car is underwater. It's that lie that we need to keep going because we can. But before very long, a wind of hurricane force called a nor'easter swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, and so we gave way and we were driven along. As we passed to a lee of small islands called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard, and then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together because they were afraid they would run aground to the sandbars and Syrtis, and they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. Okay, let's pause. Now, I feel like I'm probably the only person in the room who is like obsessed with boats, but let me just paint the picture, the imagery for you. When you're in a boat, the ground is not flat. It's got hills and valleys just like on land. And when, nowadays we have things out there to tell you, oh, it's shallow right here, it's not shallow right here. They didn't have that back then. And so one of the biggest fears when you're on the boat is to run aground, because if you run aground and it pierces the bottom of your boat, anybody knows that if water gets in the boat, you sink. When you're in the middle of the ocean and you sink, the chances of making it back to the shore are very, very low. And so they took such a violent battering that they decided, we know we're not running aground here. They put their anchors down and they decide we're just going to hunker down. And then the next day, the ship continued to rock, and they were like, okay, we're taking on water. We got to let this stuff go. But remember, I told you this was a grain ship. The whole purpose of this ship going to Rome was to make money. If we make this passage and we don't come back with the grain, we make no money. If we make no money, this was all for naught. These prisoners being here is just a favor we're doing to the Roman government. But they got in such a desperate situation that they began to throw the grain overboard. I want you to notice something, that whenever you're in a storm, your values begin to change. Because when you're in a storm, often what was once important begins to shift because you see it wasn't as important as you thought it was. It's kind of like, I thought it was important to have a nice car until you didn't have a nice car, and now that you have one, what it looks like doesn't matter. It's like, I thought that having a title was important until you were unemployed, and now just having a job or a way to make money is now important. It's like, I thought that that you closing the toothpaste was important, and then you weren't there, and now all of a sudden, it don't even matter. Do what you want to do. Whenever we find ourselves in a storm, our values tend to change. That's one of the reasons God uses storms in our lives. Because I want you to notice this, often in storms, when we put everything above God, when a storm hits, the only thing on our tongue is God. And a lot of times we'll find ourselves going through, happy-go-lucky, life is good, and I'm worried about everything else, and then the storm happens, and all of a sudden the only name I know is Jesus. And so God often uses the storm to shift you and to change what you thought about. And I want you to understand this. Every storm isn't always as blatant of a storm as this one. Sometimes a storm is you have a child that won't do what you want them to do. Sometimes a storm is you not being able to figure out why your cholesterol is up. Sometimes storms are small, sometimes they're big, but one thing that they always do if it's sent by God is it changes your value system. They start throwing the cargo overboard. The money don't matter if we don't survive. Let's keep going. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all the hope of being saved. I'm going to pause right there. So we know that storms cause our values to change. You know, storms also cause your comfort to be challenged. You know, most of us like the heat. I had a friend, and Daddy, she didn't want to call us, so she didn't call Peak Performance. But I had a friend whose heat went out. And she found a guy who said he could get her a furnace really cheap. And then y'all know it got real cold. But nobody knew how to install the furnace, and the guy was missing. The storm that they were going through challenged what they knew for comfort. They were used to being able to just walk through the house. Now, all of a sudden, they're walking through the house with a coat on and a hat on. And the storm caused them to adjust, even though it wasn't comfortable, but their survival was important. Does that make sense? Often God will use storms, and they challenge not just our values, but they challenge our comfort, because a lot of times we are comfortable in situations that are keeping us complacent. And because the things that are causing us to stay complacent are keeping us from walking in what God called us to walk in or being where God called us to be, He'll often make us uncomfortable. He even does this in nature. Y'all know when it's time for a bird to leave the nest, the mom starts putting thorns in the nest to make the baby bird jump out, to prove to itself it can fly. God does that in nature. And so a lot of times bad situations appear, but they appear so that God can show us what He's put inside of us and what He's developed. Okay, let's keep going. So they challenge our values, they challenge our comfort. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, I told you so. You should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete, then you would have spared yourselves this damage and this loss. But now I urge you to keep your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, the angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in you that it will happen just as he told me." Now watch. Paul, it sounds like Paul's like, "I told you so, y'all should listen to me. I don't know why y'all so stupid and y'all didn't listen to me." But really what he's saying, remember, I told you the right thing to do and you didn't listen. So this time you should listen. Last night, an angel came to me and said, nobody's going to die, but the ship is going to get wrecked. The ship is going to be utterly destroyed. Now, I want to, let's be real, because I think sometimes when we study this, we gloss over this. That is not a comforting message. Okay, nobody's going to die, but we're in the middle of the ocean. Anybody ever been on a ship? Y'all ever looked out the window and you see the water and you can't see nothing but water? You don't see no land. There's no trees in the distance. This is not a short swim. He says, yeah, okay, so God said nobody's going to die, but the ship is going to get wrecked. That doesn't even sound like those two things go together. But he says, an angel came to me, he said, nobody's going to die, but the storm is about to get worse. And I want to encourage us, and I wanted to cause us to think and to wrestle with this, because sometimes the way that God gets us to where he wants us to go is that he doesn't just cause a storm, and our values don't just change, and things don't just change, but he causes a storm so bad that it breaks us down so far that the only thing that we can depend on is him. I want you to think about this. Sometimes we go through storms and we kind of depend on God, but we kind of depend on us. I kind of trust God, but I'm also kind of working my thing, and I'm thinking I can build this and I can figure this out. And I'm in the middle of the storm, but the ship is still intact. So we could technically just say we waited it out. But sometimes God will break down everything around you, tear it all to pieces, tear it all to shreds. And he says he does that so that your full attention is on him. Consider this. Y'all remember that night where Jesus was walking on water? And you remember Peter sees him and says, "Hey, can I come to you?" And he starts walking. And then he starts walking, but then he looks other places, he had the ability to be oh, there's other things here. And the moment that he was oh, it's cool, this is I'm standing on water. And man, those stars are bright. And look, I'm standing on water. Notice I'm putting a lot of emphasis on I'm standing on water. I'm walking on water, and I took a step on the water. He took his eye off the master. And when he took his eye off the master, what happened? He started sinking. He started falling. And it wasn't until Jesus reaches his hand and pulls him back up that he finds this thing called survival. A lot of times we'll be in the middle of a situation where we're okay, this is not that bad. This is an abnormal situation. This isn't normal, but I think I can survive. I think I can make this. I think that if I keep my head up high and I do what my mom and daddy raised me to do, we'll make it through it. If you do what they tell us to do here in the South, I can pull myself up by my bootstraps, right? But a lot of times, God doesn't want bootstrap faith. He wants total faith. And I think it's really easy to try to be I'm going to put it back together myself. And especially those of us, how can I say this politely? Maybe I shouldn't say it all. Especially those of us who have never needed help. Some people need help and have needed help before and have had to humble themselves. But people who have gone their whole lives and never had to ask anybody for anything, you just go get an extra shift and you figure it out. You just go read an extra book and you figure it out. You can't afford it, so you build it. And so you spend your whole life figuring it out, and you kind of, sort of have become the God of your life. You come to church, you honor God, and you see God as this far smiter in the air, but you've never had to totally and completely depend on God. A lot of times God will do that so that he can break you down so that you can see him. Y'all remember Job, right? You know, in chapter 42 of Job, which is the last chapter in the book of Job, Job said, I had heard about you by the hearing of ears. And you remember the beginning of the whole book, Job found himself like he was making offerings. He was worshiping God. He was a righteous guy. God even said that he was blameless. And then he loses everything. But at the end, he says, I had heard about you from the hearing of ears. But after this storm, I see you. I see you. I connect with you on a different level because as the storm raged, I couldn't lean on me. And if I would have leaned on me, or if I would have even done what my wife said, I wouldn't be here right now. So Paul, he says, keep your courage, men, for I have faith in God that he will make this happen just as he told me. Let's keep going. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So we got to crash. And on the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. And a short time later, they took soundings again and found that they was 90 feet deep. And fearing that they would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. So they holding on for dear life. They dropped the anchors and maybe we can just sit still. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the light boat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the boat. Watch this. The angel came and told Paul, the ship is going to get destroyed. Just stay with Paul, and Paul is going to be okay. But we're going to try to save ourselves. Watch. They're in the middle of the storm, but they haven't been broken down already. So in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors, the folks responsible for the boat, responsible for everybody, they let the lifeboat down, pretending that they were going to lower some anchors from the boat. So they're going to abandon everybody. 31. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldier, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes, held the lifeboat, and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now notice this. Y'all know on the Day of Atonement, that's the only day that the Jews fast. It's been 14 days since the Day of Atonement, but they haven't eaten because their nerves are really bad. And I don't know about you, when my nerves get really bad, and I mean really bad because it don't happen that often, I forget to eat. And I know that's a really bad place to be, but you forget to eat. They, for 14 days, have been so stressed out about living that they forgot to eat. And Paul, but how many of you know that when you don't eat, y'all seen the Snickers commercial? You get hangry, and your brain don't function right, and you start doing stuff that don't make sense. Paul said, look, y'all got to eat, because look, we're not going to make it through this storm if you don't eat and get some sustenance for not just your body, but for your mind. He says, y'all go ahead and eat, and no one will lose a single hair from their head. 35. After he said this, he took some bread, and he gave thanks to God in front of them all, and he broke it, and he began to eat. They were all encouraged, because eating helps, and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. And when they had eaten as much as they wanted and lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea, so they got rid of all the money, when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, and they decided to run the ship aground as if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea. At the same time, they untied the ropes and that held the rudders, and then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship stuck on a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken into pieces by the pounding of the surf. Now, God, why would you get us so close to land and still break the ship down? Why would you get us so close? We were so close to just making it in. We could see the land. Why would you let that happen? And I want to ask this question. How many of us have ever been able to be like, okay, God, I was in a storm. The storm is almost over. Why did you let this happen? Why would you let this go this way? And I want us to sit in that for a second. Because I think in church we do a really good job about talking about a lot of things, but a lot of times we don't talk about we never will fully understand God's ways. But why would God allow them to see land and still wreck the boat? Any ideas? We can see our redemption. We can see how we're going to make it out. And now you just made it harder. I think the first thing that we have to consider is a lot of times most of us go our whole lives not knowing what God put in us. A lot of times we go our whole lives and we don't know that God created us for more and better because we've gotten so happy with status quo. I think the other thing that we have to consider is they still haven't had to become fully dependent on God. They're stressed. It's a bad situation, but we just threw stuff off the boat hoping that we could get things back in balance. We're still working our own methods and ways, and short of a boat, you're looking to the boat to save you and not to God. And so with the shore in view, the boat crashes. But the waves are still rocking. And the waves are still beating and thrashing. And with any logic, this seems like a moment of death, certain death. 42. The soldiers, watch this, planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. Now, we've almost made it. But the centurion, remember, he favored Paul, wanted to spare Paul's life. And he kept them from carrying out their plan, and he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and to get to land. And the rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. Go back to 43. Watch this. I like this passage because I want you to notice something that's deeper here. The centurion favored Paul. And so he looked at all 276 people on board and he said, who can swim? Some people had a skill set that seemingly could save their life. So he sends them to the shore. He allows them to swim. We're all in a bad situation. The boat is going down. But he doesn't just stop and say, well, if you can't swim, you messed up. It's all right. As the people are swimming back, he says, all right, let's start taking the boat apart and let's figure out what can float. And they began to get things and get pieces of wood. Now, wood is relatively buoyant, but it's not necessarily the perfect thing to float on. But this is how God shows his providence. They begin to take apart the boat, and they begin to float on pieces of the boat, and it acts as a raft to get them across to the other side. But what's amazing here is this stuff is not sealed. When we read in the Bible and they build Noah's Ark, or they build Moses' Ark, or they build anything, we see something that occurs where they pitch the boat in, they seal it. And we can even build boats today where we build them out of wood, but they have to be sealed. When the boat came apart, there's no seal. There's nothing to make this thing float. But we're going to take pieces of this boat that shouldn't float anymore because it's no longer sealed, and all these folks are going to float across the water without anything that should reasonably cause us to float. I want you to notice how good God is. God had to demonstrate not just to Paul, but to this entire boat of people who would have never believed in his power, how good he is, not by what Paul said about him, but by the demonstration of how miraculous he was. This isn't just a miracle because they didn't die. This is a miracle because God defied physics. And he didn't just defy physics in front of one guy on a road. He defied physics in front of a crowd of 276. Like, this is not a situation where we could be like, oh, well, yeah, me and Paul were out there and this happened. All of these people saw and survived. If I see that, I experience that, I'm getting to the shore and I'm asking Paul, tell me about your God. Explain to me what it is about this God that saved us in this moment, because we were praying to whomever we were praying to and it wasn't working. But you got a word from your God, and somehow we floated to the seashore and I can't even swim. In the middle of the ocean. Like, we're not in Lake Martin. This is not a river. This is not the Coosa River. This is the ocean. And we all made it to the shore. It's amazing, is it not? And so as we wrap it, we're going to wrap it up tonight, and tomorrow, next week we'll do a recap and we'll go through 28. But I want you to consider this, that all storms are not a bad thing. And on the outside, storms look bad. On the outside, when somebody comes home and they have bad news, or you go to work and there's bad news, or you look on the news and there's bad news, a lot of times we look at those and we go into panic mode. But a lot of times, God is using these things to cultivate something in us so that his glory may be fulfilled through us and in the earth. Any questions, any comments? No? Man, y'all have been silent tonight. All right, we're gonna finish Acts next week. And then we will move on to our next study. I'll probably announce what we're doing next month, because my fast will be over by the end, so I'll be sure. Let's pray. God, we love you and we thank you and we praise you. You are holy and righteous and marvelous, and we thank you for all that you are and all that you do. God, I pray that you would redeem our time. I want to thank you for every person that came out, God. I thank you for blessing them and keeping them, God, and we thank you for their press and their sacrifice, God. I pray for every person who's watching online, God. I pray that you would continue to help them to grow and to see you in the fullness of your power. Now, God, redeem our time. Help us to accomplish all we need to accomplish and keep us safe, safely nestled in the bosom of your care. In Jesus' name we do pray. Amen. Well, good people, we'll see you Sunday and next week. Y'all be blessed.